this time I've decided we're going to have a look at Chapter 1, the land of Britain. I'm going to use my pointer, which is just an ink pen. If it can be claimed that the whole of our country, and not only its surviving antiquities, should be seen as the creation of past generations, it is legitimate to go much further, to penetrate below the surface of pasture, arable woodland, and waste, and to see the whole substance of the island as one continuous creation. Through milliards of years, it has been built and shaped, sometimes lying as a part of a vast continent, embracing what is now the Atlantic and North America, sometimes part of the seabed of equally vast oceans. Tropical, desert and Arctic climates have played over it. So, side by side with the evolution of life, the land of Britain was brought into being. The remodelling of its surface by man belongs to this continuous and still rapidly developing process. Before the emergence of the creative force of imagination and intellect, life could leave its mark only in the physical remains of its creatures. In this it was prodigal. Often, layers of rock may be largely composed of the remains of reptiles, fish, corals, mollusks, plants, and many other living forms. There are, for example, the famous Purbeck marbles, made through the accumulation of the bodies of water snails on the floor of a long-forgotten lake. There are the Ludlow bone beds, where fragments of innumerable fish have been swept together and cemented into a rocky mass. Sometimes men have used these organic formations for their buildings and works of art, and so we see a curious interplay between lowly forms of life and the creative imagination achieved by its highest forms. The product of the slow processes of inorganic nature, of life and of mind, is the familiar landscape of contemporary Britain. The folding of our area of the earth's crust has determined that the most ancient rocks are exposed in the north and west of the island, and slope consistently downwards towards the south and east, until in the region of the capital they lie many miles below the feet of Londoners. On them the younger formations rest, layer upon layer, like a tilted pack of cards, the youngest of all, as it were the top cards, forming the surface in some parts of our southern and southeastern counties. By travelling from East Anglia across country to North Wales, one is travelling back and back into time, starting from sands and gravels laid down when humans of a kind were already hunting with well-made stone implements. The traveller crosses first the chalk and then the limestone belt deposited during the rise and fall of the dinosaurs and other great reptilian monsters, and passes on to the old red sandstone, whose formation coincided with the dominance of strange fishes in tropical seas. So at last he reaches the country distances of the Atlantic and the continental landmass of Europe and Asia do much to determine how and where the human population must live. While there are the innumerable local differences determined by the presence of minerals such as iron and coal, or of good and bad farming land, of pasture and arable, there are also the more general contrasts imposed by mountains and moorland on the one hand, and the softer, more genial English lowlands on the other. In the lowlands, after a prolonged struggle against the forest, man has in the end had it all his own way. The whole surface landscape is of his creation. The mountains are not to be tamed, they still dominate the people who live among them, asserting some positive being of their own, from which emanates the grandeur, solitude and tranquillity which Wordsworth sought and celebrated. Even after the Industrial Revolution, the structure and climate of Britain still partially control the manner of our life in the island. During the 4,000 years between the earliest cultivation of the land and the beginning of the Revolution, the control was, of course, far more tyrannical. Of those millennia from 2300 BC to AD 1700, the first two saw men always taking the path of least resistance, as it were, fitting themselves into the weak places left in nature's defences. It was during the last 2,000 years that men took the offensive and so far subdued nature that the Industrial Revolution became a possibility. In later chapters, England and Wales will be anatomised, examined part by part as the traveller must visit them. Before this dissection, the country should be viewed as a whole, so that it is possible to see the larger features which determined both the movement and the settlement of prehistoric peoples. To the peoples themselves, this structure must long have remained unknown or only dimly guessed. It is doubtful whether any man, however gifted, would have been able to make even a rough sketch of the country sooner than the late Bronze Age, when travelling bronze merchants must have been able to form a more or less coherent picture both of the island itself and of its relation to the continent. Nevertheless, though they could not visualise the map, the land controlled the way in which successive invaders and their descendants penetrated and settled Britain, and the lines of trade and communication which, however tenuously at first, linked the scattered and largely self-sufficient settlements. To understand in greater detail how in practice the land guided the destinies of its inhabitants, it is best to consider England and Wales in those two bold divisions which geographers have now made familiar. One of them is the English Lowlands, all that part of the country which we have recognised as being comparatively youthful, with none of its visible features more than 200 million years old. The other is the mountain and moorland country, or Highlands, starting in the south-western peninsula with the moors of Cornwall, Devon and Somerset, then including the Mendips and the whole mountain stronghold of the Welsh Principality with its bastions, projecting into the English border country. After the gap of the Cheshire Plain, we are in Highland territory again, with the Pennines and North Yorkshire moorlands, and all the rocky country to the north and west of them, Durham, Northumberland and the mountains of Cumberland and Westmoreland. Untold millions of years have made the Highland rocks immensely hard, and two distinct periods of early to the seabirds. Yet it is rare to find many miles of cliff unbroken by a river mouth or a bay where boats can be beached, and in some stretches there are extensive coastal plains and wide estuaries where low-lying, cultivable land edges the mountain and moorland behind. Apart from those regions, usually on the margins of the greater mountain masses, where iron, coal and other minerals have brought industrialisation, the ancient rocks have guarded something of the wildness of the past, a world utterly remote from the domesticity of rural England, a world of cracks and boulders, of heather and peatbogs, and clear, swift streams and rivers. The moors and mountains have their natural population of grouse, black game, curlew, merlin and buzzard. The rivers their salmon and trout, and the plump dippers that fish from their boulders and nest behind their waterfalls. Away from the industrial areas, most of the human population live by small-scale dairy farming and running mountain sheep, or by fishing. The fishing villages grow on bays and inlets with ready landing places. Small towns sometimes develop at the mouths of valleys, while above them the villages grow smaller and smaller. Towards the narrow valley heads, isolated farms stand high up in the side valleys where they may be just soil and grazing for the support of a single family. Each bay, each valley, is commonly cut off from the next by bleak promontories and ridges, and so the people living in them are isolated, divided into small communities. For the rest, the Highland country has become a resort for visitors, a region which, having held the Industrial Revolution at bay, offers wildness to a people exhausted by city life or a little wearied by the mild charms of the English countryside. There the rich go to indulge the passion for hunting that has been an upper-class prerogative since the Bronze Age, while the poor walk, climb and visit antiquities. Along almost the whole of their frontier, the division between Highland and Lowland is sharply drawn. The mountain scarp shows as a wall rising abruptly above the mildly undulating lowland. Seen from the scarp, the lowlands flow away like a sea below lofty cliffs. They are two confronted and contrasting worlds, except for scattered outcrops such as Charnwood Forest, where the jagged edges of ancient rocks thrust through the softer ground. The youthful lowlands lack age-hardened rocks with a strength to maintain heights and sharp outlines against the endless forces of denudation. Yet no one could think of them as a featureless expanse of undulating plain and level fen. They have their own pattern of uplands, a pattern already made familiar in the schoolroom by those relief maps in painted plaster which show the low-lying country in sleek spreads of green, and the uplands embossed at twice their natural height as crinkled ridges of fawn and brown. With this emphasis, the upland miles outside Cambridge, and Norfolk Edge. It is cut by the Wash, but rises again boldly to the north in the Lincolnshire and Yorkshire wolds. Continuing to follow these spokes of the wheel of the hills, the next is already to the south of the Thames Valley, leaving Salisbury Plain by the Hampshire Downs. The chalk thrusts one long finger, the North Downs, to the sea at Dover, while a shorter one forms the beautiful line of the South Downs. The South Downs extend behind a chain of seaside resorts and finally reach the sea, breaking off in the tremendous white bastion of Beachy Head, a sheer drop of cliffs far nobler than their more famous counterpart at Dover. A short southern spur of upland is formed by the Western Downs, which extend to the Channel coast between the two pleasant resorts of Lyme Regis and Weymouth. At Lyme, the lofty but crumbling cliffs of the Blue Lias are so crowded with fossils, from the slender spikes of belemnites and coiled formality of ammonites to ichthyosaurs and other marine monsters, that to hunt them is a recognised sport for visitors. Finally, the radial pattern is completed on the western side by the fine ridge of the Mendips, but these hills of more ancient formation belong geologically to the Highlands. Today, if one looks down on the Kent and Sussex Weald from the North or South Downs, or on the Severn Valley from the Cotswolds, it is still easy to feel that one is looking from an open onto a forest country. When seen from no great height, all the trees which farmers leave standing by streams, roads, and in their hedges, all of the small patches of woodland, merge together to give this forested appearance to what is in fact fully cultivated agricultural land. This picture represents an undoubted historical truth. The scattered trees are the memory of great forests, when, well after the final retreat of the ice sheets, Britain assumed approximately its present geographical form. Most of the low-lying land, including the valleys of the great rivers flowing between the upland ridges, was not only hidden below a close canopy of trees, but made almost impassable by a tangle of them, bramble and other undergrowth. In contrast, the uplands, though they did not show the bare tops of our present landscape, were relatively open. The tree growth was light enough to allow passage and encourage clearance. Given these contrasting conditions, it was inevitable that from the time of the arrival of the earliest farming people over 4,000 years ago, wave after wave of the prehistoric invaders who sailed to our southern and eastern coasts made their way onto the uplands and lived there, islanded above the forests. These chalk and limestone hills offered pasture for the cattle and sheep that were their main support, and a light soil suitable to tillage with the hoe and digging stick, which for long remained the only agricultural equipment. There they lived, clearing the woodland, tilling small patches of ground, and treading out trackways along the ridges to serve them for trade. Petty migration and war. There too they built the cattle enclosures, the forts and entrenched settlements, the burial mounds, chambered tombs and sanctuaries whose ruins survive as their chief memorial. Because the upland ridges and their roads converged on the central chalk massif of Wiltshire, that region became the richest and probably the most thickly populated area in England, a preeminence clearly shown by the large number and distinction of monuments recessive pattern. While the herdsmen, warriors, bronze workers and merchants came to the plain for their various purposes by upland tracks from which, as they trudged or rode, they looked down across mile after mile of treetops. All those travellers who have come to London during the last 1900 years have usually approached the city either by water or by valley roads, from which, if the trees did not crowd too closely, they could look up at the hills which rose above them or filled a distant horizon. The change from Salisbury Plain to London, as the centre of England's thoroughfares and of its prosperity, represents the shift in the relationship between human settlement and the land which began late in prehistoric times, made some slight progress under the Romans, and was pushed rapidly towards completion by the Anglo-Saxons. This was, of course, the movement of population from the uplands to the valleys and plains which became possible with the clearing of the forests. 1,000 years later, there was to be another equally great migration when the Industrial Revolution led men to swarm around the mineral deposits of the island. But for the Saxons, the economic magnet was the richer soil with its sure promise of abundant harvests. The once populous hills are today relatively thinly settled and may even show as islands of uncultivated land in our rural landscape. Just because of the swing of population to the richer soils, the English uplands and the moors and mountains to the west have in many areas been little cultivated, from late Saxon times until our own. Turf and heather have been allowed to grow over prehistoric fields, houses, forts, temples and graves, and they have survived secure from the ploughman's and builder, whose age-long energy has destroyed so much where settlement has been continuous. Certainly, it is a happy state of affairs for the seeker of antiquity. Today, the regions where prehistoric remains are abundant and fine are often also regions of great and untarnished natural beauty. It may be a Celtic hill fort, its banks riding serenely on a swelling chalk crest, all warlike spirit gone from it with its people, but still lording it over the villages strung along the valley at its foot. It may be a stone burial chamber gaunt among the heather on some Atlantic promontory, emptied even of its charnel bones, but still waiting above the seaway which once carried these vanished dead. To go to them equally open to the timelessness of the natural sea